The small scout ship glided silently through Earth's upper atmosphere, its sleek silver hull reflecting the golden rays of the rising sun. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Rose adjusted her monitoring equipment with practiced ease. Her pale blue fingers danced across the holographic controls as she recorded yet another set of atmospheric readings. This was her 15th orbit around the planet, but Earth's beauty still took her breath away. The swirling white clouds, vast blue oceans, and patches of green and brown landmasses created a stunning view that no amount of training could have prepared her for. Even after 3 days of observation, she couldn't help but pause occasionally to admire the planet's natural splendor. Status report recording, Day 3, Hour 72. Rose spoke clearly into her ship's log. Atmospheric composition remains consistent with previous scans. Human activity detected primarily in urban centers, as expected. No indication that our presence has been noticed. She paused, then added, "The species continues to show remarkable resilience despite their technological limitations." The scout ship's main purpose was to evaluate humanity's readiness for first contact. Rose's people had been watching Earth for decades, but this was the closest they'd ever come to the surface. The Council had finally decided that humanity might be mature enough for diplomatic relations, but they needed final confirmation. As she began another scanning sequence, the ship suddenly shuddered. Rose frowned, checking her instrument panel. Everything appeared normal, but her years of experience told her something wasn't right. The subtle vibration in the deck plates felt wrong. "Computer, run full diagnostic," she commanded, her four-fingered hand already moving to activate the backup systems. The holographic displays flickered, something that should have been impossible with their technology. Warning signals flashed across her screens in rapid succession. The ship shuddered again, more violently this time. "Engine core destabilizing," the computer announced in its calm voice. "Unknown interference detected in primary systems." Rose's training kicked in immediately. She initiated emergency protocols, trying to stabilize the failing systems. "Computer, identify source of interference," she ordered, her voice steady despite the growing danger. The response wasn't encouraging. Unable to comply. All scanning systems compromised. The ship began to lose altitude, its nose dipping toward the planet below. Rose fought with the controls, her movements precise despite the increasing gravity. She had trained for emergency scenarios countless times, but this was different. None of her emergency measures seemed to have any effect. "Mayday, Mayday," she broadcast on all frequencies. "This is Scout Ship 7 Alpha 3, experiencing critical systems failure. Request immediate assistance." The only response was static. Whatever was affecting her ship's systems was also blocking her communications. Through the viewscreen, she could see the curve of the planet growing larger. They were falling into the atmosphere at the wrong angle. The ship's hull began to glow as friction with the thickening air created intense heat. Warning alarms blared throughout the cabin. "Hull integrity at 60%, the computer announced. "Recommendation: immediate evacuation." Rose knew she had to make a decision quickly. Stay with the ship and try to save it, or abandon it and trust in her survival pod. Another violent shake made the decision for her as cracks appeared in the viewscreen. "Computer, initiate emergency protocol Omega," she commanded. "Transfer all data to survival pod and prepare for emergency ejection." The ship's automatic systems responded instantly, encasing her in a protective survival pod. Through its smaller viewport, she could see the mountain ranges of what humans called the Pacific Northwest growing rapidly larger. As the pod separated from the dying ship, Rose caught one last glimpse of her vessel breaking apart in a spectacular display of light and energy. Then the pod's own systems began to flash warnings, and she realized with growing dread that whatever had affected her ship was now interfering with her survival pod. The last thing she saw was the tops of tall evergreen trees rushing up to meet her, their branches reaching for her like eager hands ready to catch a falling star. The survival pod tumbled through the atmosphere, its stabilizers fighting a losing battle against the unknown interference. Inside, Rose gripped her harness tightly, her training warring with instinct as the ground grew closer with each passing second. Warning lights bathed the small cabin in an eerie red glow. Emergency landing protocols engaged, the pod's computer announced, its voice unnaturally calm. Warning: multiple system malfunctions detected. Optimal landing probability: 47%. Rose knew those odds were bad. Very bad. On a normal day, the pod's landing systems would guarantee a safe touchdown with 99.9% certainty. Something on this planet was affecting their technology in ways their scientists hadn't predicted. The pod's internal gravity stabilizers flickered and failed. Rose felt her stomach lurch as true free fall took hold. Through the small viewport, she could see the morning sun reflecting off a layer of mist that hung between the mountain peaks. It would have been beautiful if it wasn't so terrifying. Altitude: 10,000 meters, the computer reported. Main landing thrusters offline. Switching to backup systems. Rose's fingers flew across the emergency controls. If she could just get the backup thrusters to fire correctly, she might survive this. The pod spun wildly, giving her alternating views of mountains and sky. Her training helped her fight off the dizziness, staying focused on the task at hand. Altitude: 5,000 meters. Backup thrusters responding at 23% capacity. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Rose knew the math. She needed at least 60% thrust to slow her descent to survivable speeds. She diverted power from life support, knowing she'd either land safely in the next few minutes or wouldn't need oxygen anymore anyway. Altitude: 2,000 meters. Warning: impact imminent. Engaging emergency cushioning systems. The pod's interior began to fill with impact gel, a special substance designed to protect occupants during crash landings. Rose took one last deep breath before the gel covered her completely. Through the thick liquid, she could still see the trees getting closer. Time seemed to slow down. Rose watched as the first branches scraped against the pod's hull, sending it spinning in a new direction. The pod's remaining sensors screamed warnings as it crashed through the forest canopy. Each impact felt like a hammer blow, even through the protective gel. A massive pine tree caught the pod, briefly slowing its descent. Metal screamed as the hull tore open along one side. Cold mountain air rushed in, dispersing some of the impact gel. Rose felt the bitter chill against her skin just before the pod broke free and continued its fall. The ground rushed up to meet them. In the last second, Rose saw a small clearing ahead. If she was very lucky, the softer ground there might absorb some of the impact. She tried to shift the pod's trajectory using the last sputtering bursts from the maneuvering thrusters. The impact, when it came, was both softer and harder than she expected. Softer because the clearing soil was indeed relatively loose, but harder because all of the pod's remaining systems failed at exactly the wrong moment. The protective gel, which should have hardened on impact to cocoon her, remained liquid. Rose felt her body slam against the harness. Something cracked, probably several somethings. The pod skidded and rolled, throwing her around like a toy despite the restraints. Her head struck the side of the cockpit, and lights exploded behind her eyes. As the pod finally came to rest, Rose tried to move. Her body wouldn't respond. The cold mountain air poured in through the torn hull, mixing with the leaking impact gel. She could smell pine needles and wet earth, her first direct experience of Earth's atmosphere. How ironic that it might also be her last. Her vision began to darken around the edges. The last thing she saw was sunlight streaming through the trees above, creating dancing patterns on what remained of the pod's interior. Then everything went black, and Lieutenant Rose's heart, which had beat steadily through the entire ordeal, finally stopped. Jack pulled his rescue service truck to a stop at the mountain overlook. Something had lit up the dawn sky like fireworks, leaving trails of smoke and debris across the mountains. In 15 years of mountain rescue work, he'd never seen anything quite like it. He grabbed his binoculars from the passenger seat and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The pine trees swayed gently in the breeze as he scanned the mountainside, looking for signs of whatever had come down. His radio crackled to life. "Base to Unit 7. Any visual on the meteor?" The dispatcher's voice was clear despite the mountain terrain. "Negative, base," Jack replied, adjusting his focus. But that was no meteor. The descent pattern was all wrong. Looked more like... He stopped himself. After serving as a combat medic and now working mountain rescue, Jack had learned when to keep certain observations to himself. "Like what, Unit 7? "Like maybe a small aircraft," he said instead. "I'm going to check it out. Might be someone in trouble up there." Jack grabbed his rescue pack from the truck. Years of experience had taught him to always be prepared for the worst. The pack contained everything from basic first aid supplies to advanced emergency medical equipment. He'd learned the hard way that in these mountains, you never knew what you might find. Following the debris trail, Jack moved quickly through the forest. His boots crunched on pine needles as he walked, eyes scanning the ground and trees for signs of wreckage. Small pieces of strange, silvery metal glinted in the morning sun. He picked up one piece. It was lighter than aluminum but felt stronger than steel. The trail of debris led him to a small clearing. Jack stopped at the tree line, his breath catching in his throat. In the center of the clearing lay what could only be described as an escape pod, though unlike any he'd ever seen. Its sleek design and silvery hull matched the debris he'd been following. "Base, Unit 7, he called into his radio. "I found something. Stand by for details." Jack approached carefully, his combat training taking over. The pod had torn open on one side, spilling the strange gel-like substance onto the ground. The gel seemed to be slowly evaporating in the morning sun, leaving no trace behind. That's when he saw her. Through the torn hull, Jack could make out a figure strapped into a harness. His medical training kicked in immediately, pushing aside all questions about her clearly non-human appearance. He pulled on his protective gloves and climbed carefully into the pod. "Subject located," he reported to base. "Unconscious, possible severe trauma." He decided not to mention her blue skin or the fact that she had 4 fingers on each hand. Jack checked for a pulse in her neck, finding the spot where her carotid artery should be. Nothing. Her skin felt cold, but not as cold as it should be given the mountain air. He pulled out his medical scanner and held it over her chest. No heartbeat, no breathing. But something wasn't right about this situation. The gel covering parts of her body seemed to have preserved her tissues. There was none of the usual signs of death he was trained to look for. "Base, do not send additional units yet," he radioed. "Situation needs special handling. Will advise." Jack's mind raced through his years of medical training. He'd seen cases where people had been recovered from freezing water, their hearts stopped for alarming amounts of time, only to be successfully revived. This felt similar, yet different. Looking at her face, Jack made a decision. The pod's technology was clearly advanced, far beyond anything he'd seen before. Maybe, just maybe, her physiology was equally advanced. Maybe there was still a chance. "Hold on," he whispered, reaching for his medical kit. "I'm not letting you die on my mountain." As he prepared his emergency equipment, the sun broke through the trees, illuminating the clearing in a golden glow. It felt like nature itself was watching to see what would happen next. Jack worked quickly, setting up his emergency equipment around the pod. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he pulled out his portable defibrillator and other medical tools. Years of treating combat injuries had taught him that every second counted. "Come on," he muttered, attaching the heart monitor pads to her chest. The gel that covered her was almost gone now, evaporating into nothing. The monitor sparked to life, but instead of the usual flat line he expected, it showed tiny, irregular spikes. "There's still electrical activity," he said to himself, hope rising in his chest. "You're not done yet." He remembered his training about extreme cold cases, how the cold could sometimes preserve life even when the heart stopped. This wasn't exactly the same, but the principle might be similar. The strange gel might have kept her cells alive, just like cold water could preserve a drowning victim. Jack pulled out a special warming blanket from his pack and wrapped it around her lower body. Next, he prepared a mixture of emergency medications. He hesitated for a moment. Her alien biology might react differently to human medicine, but doing nothing wasn't an option. "I hope your system can handle this," he said, carefully injecting the first dose of adrenaline. He watched the monitor closely, looking for any change in the weak electrical patterns. Nothing happened for several long seconds. Then suddenly, the spikes on the monitor grew stronger. "That's it," Jack encouraged, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Fight back." He prepared the defibrillator next. The computerized voice announced, "Analyzing rhythm. Shock advised." "Here we go," Jack said, placing the paddles on her chest. "Clear." Her body jerked as the electrical current passed through it. The monitor showed a brief flutter of activity, then went back to the weak pattern from before. "Again," Jack commanded, charging the device for another attempt. "Clear." This time, the response was stronger. The monitor showed more definite spikes, but still no proper heartbeat. Jack remembered something from his advanced medical training. Sometimes, the heart needed more than just electricity. It needed help remembering its rhythm. He started chest compressions, timing them carefully. 30 compressions, then we try again, he said aloud, keeping count in his head. The sun had risen higher now, warming the clearing. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he worked. As he reached 30, he grabbed the defibrillator paddles again. One more time. Clear. The shock hit, and this time the monitor erupted with activity. A strong, steady pattern appeared, different from a human heartbeat, but clearly the rhythm of a living heart. Suddenly, Rose gasped. Her eyes flew open, revealing irises that shifted color like moving water. She tried to sit up, but Jack gently held her still. "Easy there," he said softly. "You've been through quite an ordeal." Rose's eyes darted around, taking in her surroundings. Fear flashed across her face as she realized her situation. Crashed on Earth, discovered by a human. But something in Jack's steady gaze calmed her panic. "You helped me?" she asked in perfect English, her voice barely a whisper. Jack nodded, checking her vital signs again. "Couldn't just let you go without a fight. I'm Jack, by the way. Mountain Rescue." "Lieutenant Rose," she replied weakly. "Though I suppose I'm not very good at my job. I was supposed to observe your planet undetected." A small smile crossed Jack's face. "Well, if you had to crash somewhere, you picked a good spot. Not many people come up here. And you got lucky. I've got experience keeping secrets." Rose tried to move again, but winced in pain. "My ship. The interference." "Let's worry about that later," Jack said firmly, pulling out more medical supplies. "Right now, you need to rest and recover. Whatever caused your crash isn't going anywhere." As he worked to stabilize her condition, Jack couldn't help but marvel at the situation. Here he was, treating an alien visitor on a mountainside at dawn. But when he looked at her, he didn't see an alien. He just saw someone who needed help. The morning sun continued to rise, warming the clearing and glinting off the scattered pieces of the pod. In the distance, a bird called, reminding them both that the world was waking up to a day that would change everything. The mountain cabin was small but well equipped for emergencies. Jack had brought Rose here after stabilizing her condition, knowing she needed a safe place to recover. Through the cabin's windows, the afternoon sun cast warm light across the wooden floor. "Your medical technology is different," Rose said, examining the bandages on her arm. She sat propped up on the cabin's small bed, her color much better than it had been hours ago. "Simple, but effective." Jack smiled as he checked her vital signs again. "Sometimes simple is better. Your healing rate is amazing, though. These injuries would take weeks to heal in humans." Rose watched him work, curiosity replacing her earlier fear. She had studied humans from orbit for days, but seeing one up close was completely different. Their files had described humans as primitive, yet Jack had saved her life with what her people would consider basic equipment. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. "Your people aren't supposed to know about us yet." "The protocols." "Protocols." Jack raised an eyebrow as he prepared a fresh bandage. "The only protocol I care about is saving lives when I can. Human or not, you needed help." The simplicity of his answer surprised her. Her people had spent years debating whether humans were ready for contact, creating complex rules and procedures. Yet here was this human, making the right choice simply because it was right. "Tell me about your world," Jack said, pulling up a chair. "I mean, if you're allowed to. I promise whatever you say stays between us." Rose hesitated, then decided that after what he'd done, she owed him some truth. "We're from a system you haven't discovered yet. We've been watching Earth for a long time, trying to decide if your people are ready for contact." "And what's the verdict?" Jack asked, genuinely interested. "I'm not sure anymore," Rose admitted. "Before today, I thought I knew. We saw your wars, your environmental problems, your divisions, but we also saw your art, your music, your ability to overcome challenges." She paused, looking at him. "And now I've seen your capacity for kindness to a complete stranger, one who isn't even human." Jack checked the medical monitors he'd set up. "People can surprise you. We're not perfect, but we try to be better." He grinned. "Most of us, anyway." A comfortable silence fell between them. Outside, birds sang in the pine trees. Rose found herself relaxing. Despite everything she'd been taught about maintaining professional distance from study subjects. "Your heart beats differently than ours," Jack said, breaking the silence. "When I was trying to restart it, I had to adjust my technique. But in the end, a heart's still a heart. It just wants to keep beating." Rose touched her chest, feeling the steady rhythm. "In my culture, we don't usually discuss personal matters with research subjects. But I suppose you're not really a subject anymore, are you?" "You're—" She searched for the right word. "A friend." "Friend works for me," Jack replied warmly. "Though I have to admit, you're my first alien friend." "And you're my first human friend," Rose said, surprising herself with a small laugh. "The council would be very upset about this breach of protocol." "Sometimes the best things happen when we break the rules a little," Jack said, standing to check the cabin's security system. "Speaking of which, I should probably report into base soon. They think I'm tracking a lost hiker." Rose watched him, realizing how much trust he was placing in her. He could have reported her crash, called in authorities. Instead, he was protecting her, giving her time to heal and decide what to do next. "Jack," she called as he reached for his radio. "Thank you. Not just for saving my life, but for showing me what humanity is really capable of." He turned back to her, his expression sincere. "Get some rest. We can figure out the next steps tomorrow. Whatever you decide, you're not alone in this anymore." As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the trees, Rose realized that her failed mission might have succeeded in the most unexpected way possible. She had come to study humanity, but instead, she was experiencing it firsthand through the kindness of a single human who had chosen to help rather than fear her. 3 days had passed since the crash. The morning sun streamed through the cabin windows as Rose's emergency beacon suddenly came to life, its soft blue light filling the room. She stared at it, knowing what it meant. Her people had detected the signal and were coming. Jack looked up from where he was preparing breakfast. "Everything okay?" "They're coming," Rose said quietly, holding up the beacon. "My rescue team. They'll be here within hours." She watched the light pulse steadily, each beat matching the newfound rhythm of her restored heart. Jack nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. He'd known this moment would come, but over the past few days, he'd grown used to their talks, to sharing his world with someone who saw it through entirely new eyes. "I guess you'll be heading home then," he said, placing a cup of tea in front of her. He discovered she loved the taste of earth tea, especially with honey. Back to watching us from a safe distance. Rose wrapped her hands around the warm cup but didn't drink. "That's what I'm supposed to do. Return to my ship, file my report, and recommend continuing observation for another decade or two." She paused, looking out at the mountain landscape. "But I'm not sure I can do that anymore." "Because of what happened." "Because of you," she said simply. "Because in 3 days, you've shown me more about humanity than I learned in 3 years of observation. We've been so careful, so worried about contaminating your culture or causing panic, but we never considered that we might be underestimating you." Jack sat down across from her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about breaking every rule in our first contact protocols." Rose stood and walked to the window. "We've been waiting for humanity to reach some arbitrary level of advancement, some perfect moment when you'd be ready for contact. But maybe there is no perfect moment. Maybe it's about individuals, about connections." The beacon pulsed faster, indicating the rescue ship was getting closer. Rose turned back to Jack, her expression determined. "I want to recommend immediate diplomatic contact," she said. "Not in 20 years, not in 10. Now. And I want to use my experience, use what you did for me, as evidence that humanity is ready." Jack whistled softly. "That's a pretty big decision. Won't you get in trouble?" Rose smiled. "Probably. But sometimes the best things happen when we break the rules a little right." She quoted his words from days earlier. "And if they say no, then I'll fight for it. I'll tell them how you found me, how you didn't hesitate to help even though I was clearly not human, how you kept me safe and secret, not out of fear or for personal gain, but because it was the right thing to do." She touched the spot where her heart had stopped, where Jack's determination had brought her back. "One person can change everything. You taught me that." The beacon's pulsing increased again. They were very close now. "They'll be landing in the clearing where you found me," Rose said. "Will you come with me? Help me explain." Jack stood, his expression serious. "Are you sure? This could change everything, for both our worlds." "It already has," Rose replied. "At least for me. Besides, they'll need to understand why I'm making this recommendation. They need to meet the human who saved my life and changed my perspective on everything." She held out her hand, a human gesture she'd learned from him. Jack took it, smiling at how natural it felt now. "Well," he said, grabbing his medical pack out of habit, "I guess we'd better go meet your people. Should I bring tea?" Rose laughed, a sound that would have been unthinkable just days ago. "Maybe save that for the diplomatic meetings. Something tells me we're going to need it." Together, they stepped out of the cabin into the bright morning sun. Above them, through the clear blue sky, a shimmer of light announced the arrival of Rose's people. It was time to change history. The rescue ship hovered silently above the clearing, its sleek form catching the morning light. Jack and Rose stood at the edge of the trees, watching as 3 tall figures emerged from a beam of light. Like Rose, they had blue-tinted skin and 4-fingered hands, but their expressions were far less friendly. Lieutenant Rose, the tallest one, called out, his voice sharp with authority. "You've violated multiple protocols. Step away from the human immediately." Rose stood her ground, moving slightly in front of Jack instead. "Commander, with respect, we need to talk. What happened here changes everything." The commander's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. The crashed pod, the humans' medical equipment still scattered nearby, and the obvious fact that Rose was very much alive despite the crash readings they detected. "Your life signs terminated," he said, his tone softening slightly. "Yet here you stand. Explain." Rose turned to Jack, nodding encouragingly. He stepped forward, medical pack still slung over his shoulder. "Her heart had stopped," he said clearly. "I got it beating again. Used Earth medical techniques, adapted them a bit. It wasn't that complicated, really." The commander's team exchanged surprised looks. They hadn't expected such a casual response to their presence, nor such a simple explanation for what their equipment had registered as a miraculous revival. "You chose to help her," the commander said slowly, knowing she wasn't human. Jack shrugged. She needed help. That's all that mattered. Rose spoke up again, her voice stronger now. "This is exactly what I've been trying to tell you, Commander. We've been watching humanity, measuring them against our standards, our expectations. But look at what happened here. A human with primitive medical technology saved my life. Not because of protocols or policies, but because of compassion." The commander studied Jack carefully. "And you've told no one about this encounter?" "Well," Jack smiled. "I told my base I was tracking a lost hiker. Technically, I was helping someone who was lost. Just didn't mention they were lost in space rather than on a trail." A hint of amusement crossed the commander's face. "You understand the significance of this contact. The risks. Sometimes the biggest risks bring the biggest rewards," Jack replied. "Rose told me you've been waiting for humanity to be ready. Maybe we're not perfect, but we're ready to try. To learn. To grow." The commander turned to his team, speaking in their native language. Rose's eyes widened as she listened to their rapid discussion. Finally, he turned back. "Lieutenant Rose, your recommendation. Immediate diplomatic contact," she said without hesitation. "Starting small, of course. But it's time. And," she took a deep breath, "I volunteer to serve as the first ambassador to Earth." The commander nodded slowly. "And you, human, would you be willing to help bridge our worlds? To serve as a liaison, helping your people understand us as you've helped Lieutenant Rose?" Jack looked at Rose, seeing in her eyes the same hope he felt. "I'm just a mountain rescue worker," he said modestly. "But if you think I can help, I'm willing to try." "Sometimes," the commander said, "the best bridges are built by ordinary people doing extraordinary things." He stepped forward, extending his four-fingered hand in a gesture he must have learned from their observations. "We have much to discuss, but I believe Lieutenant Rose is right. The time has come." As Jack shook the commander's hand, Rose felt tears in her eyes. Her heart, the one Jack had restarted with nothing but determination and basic human medicine, swelled with emotion. What had started as a near-fatal crash had become something beautiful, the beginning of a new chapter in both their worlds' histories. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the clearing where it had all begun. Above them, birds sang in the pine trees, nature's own celebration of this historic moment. Two worlds had come together because one heart had stopped, and another heart had cared enough to start it beating again.